Good morning, everybody. My name is Stanley Chang. I have been in the mathematics department at Wellesley this is my 13th year. This is the first time I'm giving a friends and family talk. I'm very excited to be here. It's not very easy to get an audience for mathematics lectures, especially on a Saturday morning, so I commend you for your fortitude. This talk will be a very general talk about the use of mathematics in our daily lives. It's meant to enchant and surprise and elevate you. It's not meant to be anything very difficult. So, apologies for those who may be mathematicians in the audience who's looking for something a little bit more rigorous. I would like to talk about the history of prime numbers and mostly about how prime numbers feature into our daily lives. Every day when you send a text message or receive a message from someone on Skype, there is something mathematical behind it, and I will show you what it is and what the NSA is doing. Hopefully I won't disappear after this lecture. So in recent months, the NSA has featured a lot in the news. The NSA is the central producer and manager of all signals intelligence in the US. It is estimated to be one of the largest US intelligence organizations in terms of personnel and budget. It operates under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense, and it reports to the Director of National Intelligence. We don't tend to see pictures of the NSA very much. I mean, they're very, very secret, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this building in just a little bit. The NSA is primarily tasked with global monitoring, collecting, decoding, translating, analysis of information and data that is used for foreign intelligence and counterintelligence purposes. It is authorized through its mission to obtain information through any covert means possible, including bugging electronic systems and engaging in sabotage using subversive software. So the NSA is become quite prominent in the news these days, to the extent that South Park, in its first episode of the season, has done a riff on the NSA. So let's just talk a little bit about what's happened recently. The Brazilian president was very angry at the US for allegedly bugging its conversations and refuses to meet with Obama now. A couple weeks before that, there was news in the middle of September saying that the NSA was able to evade basic safeguards of internet privacy. We'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. And even before that, there was a report that the NSA has been able to compromise our use of meta telecommunication systems like Apple, Google, and BlackBerry. The National Security Agency, just to step back a little bit, was formed under Truman in 1952, and it has been, since then, implemented or sort of implicated in a number of sort of scandals. Oh, by the way, yeah, it has its own exit off of Maryland Route 295. Nobody can get in there except for NSA employees. The building itself is a conglomerate of about 1,300 buildings and has an estimated 18,000 parking spaces. It's built on 350 acres. And the main building that you saw is covered with one-way dark glass and is sort of lined with copper shielding to prevent any transport of information in and out of the building through signals. It contains 3 million square feet of space, or 68 acres, and you can actually put the US Capitol into the NSA four times. So it's that big, okay. It's very secret and we don't know anything about it. So in the 1950s, it was created, but during the sort of, after the resignation of Richard Nixon, there was suspected misuse of FBI, CIA, and NSA facilities, which was then investigated by Frank Church, who was a senator at the time. The so-called Church hearings basically uncovered some CIA plots known to JFK at the time to assassinate Fidel Castro. And because of his hearings, there were some laws that were passed In particular, they were called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. And it basically limited circumstances under which the NSA could operate. However, an amendment to this was made in the 2000s, which allowed our current president to subvert the various conditions of the original act. So in 2005, George Bush, under White House pressure, encouraged the National Security Agency to tap phone calls made from the US to foreign locations. And this was probably done under the aegis of the Patriot Act. In 2009, Obama and his administration authorized the interception of communications of American citizens themselves. So domestic wiretapping was occurring. And because of this sort of loophole in the amendment, they were able to keep doing it, in fact. Later on, NSA obtained a court order from Verizon allowing Verizon to, or requiring that Verizon make known the contents of conversations on an ongoing daily basis. Okay, so of course, this all came to a head when Edward Snowden, earlier this year, reported to the British newspaper The Guardian that the US and the British governments were conducting mass surveillance programs and also compromising US and European telephone metadata. So he was an American CIA agent, an NSA employee who was working for the contractor Booz Allen Hamilton. And of course, we all know that he was charged by the US in June of espionage and theft of government property. And before the publication of his disclosures, he escaped to Hong Kong and then to Russia, where he now has temporary asylum and is residing at an undisclosed location. Okay, so I have a friend who works for the NSA. He's been there for about 15 years. And I asked him recently, how are things going? And he said, I'm having a really bad week. So things at the NSA are not good. Okay, so that's the story with Edward Snowden. The notion of network security is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So the way that we protect our online data, whether it is a communication through a chat site or the credit card numbers that we send to vendors, involves this thing called encryption, which we'll discuss a little bit. Encryption has been used by the military and big companies for a really long time to protect their data. And now it is commonly used in civilian situations. So, for example, the Computer Security Institute reported that in 2007, at least 71% of all big companies use encryption to protect their data in transit. So data in transit means anything that's sent over the internet, mobile telephones, wireless microphones, wireless intercom systems, ATM machines, Bluetooth devices. These are all things that big companies will protect using encryption. And about 53% will protect their at-rest data, meaning their hardware, their hard drives, their USB flash drives will be protected using encryption as well. Okay. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to step back and we're going to talk about a little bit of the mathematics behind what's going on. So we're going to talk about numbers. Okay. So say I have a number like 6. Okay. This diagram represents the number 6. 6, if I give you 6 dots or 6 objects and I ask you to arrange it in a rectangle, you can do it, right? You can do it because you can make a grid that's 2 by 3, okay? And so, in effect, what you've done is you've taken the number 6 and you've broken it down into 2 and 3, okay? And therefore, 6 is called a composite number. Composite meaning it is composed of 2 smaller objects. Okay. Likewise, if I give you 15 dots, you can arrange it in a grid of 3 by 5. So the number 15 is composite, and it's composed of the numbers 5 and 3. If I took a number like 7, okay, and I tried to arrange it into a box, I can't, right? if I try to arrange it like this, there's going to be a dot leaking out that way. If I try to arrange it another way, there'll be a dot leaking out that way. So the only way that you can actually arrange the number 7 into a rectangle is actually a degenerate rectangle or a line. Okay? So if the only way that you can represent a number of dots, okay, as a box is in this line fashion, that number is called prime. Okay? So it is not composite. You cannot decompose it into pieces. It is only itself. Okay, so maybe in high school you remember these exercises, right, in which you take a number and you break it down into 2, like 60 is 3 times 20, and then you break down 20 into 4 times 5, and you break down 4 into 2 times 2. So this number is extremely, extremely not prime because you can break it down a lot. And if you look at this tree, or this inverted tree, the numbers that occur at the very, very bottom of the tree represent the primes that make up that number, okay? So you can write 60 as the product of the objects that occur at the very bottom of this diagram. So here's another example, okay? The number 77 can be only broken down very, very slightly, okay? So it can be broken down, if you have 77 dots, you can arrange them in a square or a rectangle of size 7 and 11, and so therefore 7 can be written as the product of 2 indecomposable pieces. In this case, we call this number a semi-prime. Okay? A semi-prime is not a prime because you can break it down, but you can only break it down one time. Okay? So let's just give some terminology. Okay? So a number is composite if you can arrange it as a product of 2 things. Okay? And these objects are called the factors of n. And if you cannot write n in this way, it's called prime, okay? And if a number can be written as a product of exactly 2 primes, like number 77, then it's called a semi-prime, okay? Now don't forget this definition of semi-prime because this turns out to be the most important object in encryption. Okay. So here's a list of prime numbers, right? I mean, you're probably familiar with the first couple lines, 2, 3, 5, 7. These are all numbers that are not decomposable into a product of 2 smaller primes. Notice that they get larger and larger and larger. And so one question that you can ask is, how many of them are there? Okay, can I keep going on and on? Does this list ever end? In other words, if I give you a prime number, can you find a bigger one? Okay. So you certainly don't want your prime numbers to run out. Okay. So just to give you an idea of how difficult this problem can be, if I give you this many dots, okay, and this is what faces mathematicians who work in the encryption industry, I give you this many dots and I say, arrange it into a box, okay? Arrange it into a box perfectly, right? It's not very easy to figure out how to do that because you can do it by brute force, but if this number is humongous, then the time that it'll take is going to be sort of unfathomably large, okay? So let's step back to 300 BC. 300 BC is where it all starts. The famous mathematician Euclid, who was also an astronomer, among other things, is known as the father of geometry. He resided in Alexandria. And his book called The Elements was one of the most important documents in mathematical history and influences the pedagogy of mathematics even today. Okay? So what Euclid did with prime numbers was he proved, way back in 300 BC, that there are infinitely many of them. Okay? That if you give me any group of prime numbers, I can find one that's bigger than everything that you've written. So this tells us, okay, that there is no end to the prime numbers that we have. Okay. Now he doesn't tell us how to find them. He just tells us that they're there. Okay. How to find them depends on this guy right here, who was born about 100 years later in 200 BC. This guy's name was Eratosthenes of Cyrene. Eratosthenes was a pretty amazing guy. He was an astronomer, he was a poet, he was a music theorist, and a mathematician. He did some pretty amazing things. For example, he traveled from Cyrene to Alexandria, and he made measurements. And with those measurements, he was able to figure out the circumference of the Earth. Okay? So the Greeks knew that the Earth was round, and somehow that knowledge was lost for almost 2 millennia. Okay? It's pretty astounding. He also figured out how much the axis of the Earth tilted. Okay? He invented the leap day, okay? And he figured out how far the Earth was from the sun. Okay, that's pretty amazing, right? What he did for mathematics was this thing called the Sieve of Eratosthenes, okay? Here's how the sieve works. Suppose you were interested in knowing, oh, I spelled Eratosthenes wrong, sorry. Suppose you took all the numbers from 1 to 100, and you were interested to know which numbers were prime, okay? And the way that the sieve works is the following. You start with the number 2, okay? And what you do is you circle the number 2, and then every 2 after that, you paint orange, okay? Now, all of these numbers, like 4, 6, 8, 10, they all have 2 as a factor. So they're composite, okay? Then after you've done that, then you start with the number 3, okay, which is the next uncolored number. And then every 3, you're going to color something else. Now, if you go 3 from 3, you get 6, but that's already colored. So you're going to color the thing that's not colored. So all the things in green are the new things that you've eliminated. Well, 4 is already covered, so you ignore that. So then you look at 5, and then you do the same thing with 5. Okay, so therefore, what you're doing is you're sieving these numbers. You're putting them into a colander, right? And then you're sieving them. After you finish sieving the whole process, the things that are never ever touched are the prime numbers. Okay? So if you look at the white numbers at the end, then those numbers are prime. Okay. So this was the basic mechanism for finding prime numbers until about 1600. Okay? So there were a lot of monks in the medieval period whose basic task it was to spend decades sieving numbers up to 10 million. Okay? And that they had that much time. So one of the things I want to they didn't have like Facebook, right? So they were sieving numbers. And there was actually a story about this Dutch monk who lost these pages between like 1 million and 4 million, and they were found like centuries later, in some vault. But what I want to impress upon you is how difficult it was to do the things that we take for granted now. Okay, everything was done by hand. Everything took decades to do, and now we move on to this guy named Marin Mersenne, who was a French poet, a theologian, a mathematician, and he was called the Father of Acoustics because he studied music theory and how waves affect the sound of music. So he was a monk in France, but he also taught at the universities there. What Marin Mersenne did was that he became kind of the hub of all knowledge in Europe at the time. So he would sort of stake out a place in his monk cell, and then people would come from all over France and talk to him. So he became kind of like the I don't know, the Anderson Cooper of the day, right, where information would be promulgated, and everybody, so in the days before scientific journals, he was the sort of repository or the nexus of information at the time, okay? What Mersenne, well, here's a little bit of information about him. He studied the oscillation of strings, optics, the swinging pendulum. Many mathematicians in the past were also physicists and music theorists, okay? So one thing that I want to do is I want to talk about these that were popularized by Mersenne, called the Mersenne numbers, okay? Now the Mersenne numbers look like numbers of very easy forms. So you take number 2, you raise it to some power, and then you subtract 1, okay? So 2 to the 2 is equal to 4, you subtract 1, you get 3. 2 to the 3 is 8, subtract 1 is equal to 7. 2 to the 4 is 16, minus 1 is 15. So you get a list of numbers, all of which are powers of 2 minus 1. Okay? Now these numbers don't look like anything special, but let me show you that they actually have a fun application. If I could just bring up this website. Okay, so this is called the Tower of Hanoi problem. Maybe I should just, can everybody see the Tower of Hanoi right here? So the Tower of Hanoi problem, okay, is a game, it's a puzzle by which you have 3 pegs and you have a certain number of discs. The object behind the puzzle is to move that pile of discs onto another peg, okay, and retaining the same formation at the very end. But you can never actually place a larger disc on a smaller disc. Okay, so if you look at this, let's wait until the animation familiar with this puzzle? I mean, okay, are we done here? All right, so here we have 4 pegs. We have 3 pegs, and we have 4 discs. So if you count the number of moves you need to make without making any 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, right, 15. So 15 is the number of moves you need to make to solve the Tower of Hanoi problem. And in fact, and that's because the number 4 shows up in the exponent here. Let's blow this back up again. Okay, so we all love these numbers. Okay. Notice that sometimes the Mersenne number is prime and sometimes it is not. Okay. So for example, 2 to the 4th minus 1 is 15, 2 to the 6th minus 1 is 63, 2 to the 8th is 255. Sometimes it is prime and sometimes it is not. Okay? But let's look at the places where they are not prime. So if you look at the numbers 3, 7, 31, and 127, these guys are prime. Okay? But notice the exponents here are also prime. Okay. So it seems to me that given the small data, if you have a prime number here, then the Mersenne number associated with it will be prime. This is very exciting because it tells us that we can generate primes from existing primes. Okay? People were fairly excited about that. Okay? So it seems that if p is prime, okay, then 2 to the p is 2 minus 1 is prime. Okay? Again, this is exciting because we're interested in finding large prime numbers, and this seems to be a nice recipe to do it. So in the next couple hundred years, people were studying numbers of the form 2 to the prime minus 1. 2 to the prime minus 1. We were interested to know whether 2 to the prime minus 1 is equal to a prime number. Well, certainly for small data it seems to be, and in the various centuries following the 1400s, these numbers are getting very, very large, but people were spending a lot of time trying to prove things about them. Well, there seems to be a problem, because this guy turns out to be 23 times 89. Okay? This is bad news. Okay, this is bad news. Yeah, it was like a dark day in mathematics. Right? So we found out that, so now what we know is that sometimes they're prime and sometimes they're not, okay? Which doesn't really help us very much. And that's where the games start. Okay, so if it is prime, then it's called a Mersenne prime. Okay, if it's not a prime, then we don't call it anything. Okay. So here's an amazing number. 2 to the 127 minus 1 is a humongous number, and somebody figured out in 1876 that this guy was prime. I don't know how he did it, but these things take a lot of work, and that's one of the themes I want to discuss with you, and that is that the amount of work it takes to do this is monumental. So in the next couple centuries, people started looking up Mersenne numbers. Okay, these are all prime numbers, but they all turn out to be composite. Okay, so these are the smallest factors of it. So in other words, if I took this humongous number, which by the way has 10 to the 12 digits, okay, then this number actually factors into it. And people were getting fairly despondent about the nature of Mersenne numbers. Let me just tell you how, but people were still excited about the technology that people use. Notice that this number is 53, okay, already a really huge number. So there was this famous mathematician named Frank Nelson Cole. He was actually born in Ashland, which is only about 20 minutes away from here. He taught at Harvard and then Columbia and then the University of Michigan. His claim to fame was the following. In 1903, he presented a talk at the American Mathematical Congress, okay, during which he did not say a single word, okay? What he did was he took the number 2 to the 67 minus 1, okay, which turned out to be like 147 quintillion or something like that. He took this number and he wrote it on one side of the board, and he multiplied the whole thing out until he got that number, and it took him about half an hour. On the other side of the board, he wrote these two numbers, okay? And he proceeded in the next half hour to multiply this out by hand, and he showed that these two numbers were the same, okay? Now, you may think that this is a terribly vain exercise in nothingness, right? But in fact, the entire audience, after his voiceless lecture, gave him a standing ovation. Because it was that exciting. I mean, you may not think it's exciting, but it took him, he said, 3 years worth of Sundays to do this, okay? So in order to achieve some of this, you need to have like some craziness in you that makes you not give up on these things, okay? And then you go down in history as the guy who did this, okay? So, but there is success. In the 1900s, basically what happened was that the factorization numbers stopped being done by hand, and it was done by computers, okay? So it turns out that they did find Mersenne numbers which were prime, okay? They did not follow any logical order, but these are the number of digits it has. I mean, they're humongously big numbers, and people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out clever ways of factoring these numbers. In the end, what happened is that as of 2013, they have only found 48 Mersenne primes, which is not a lot, okay? Not a lot. These two numbers, okay, are the first Mersenne primes that have more than 10 million digits. I mean, that's just incomprehensibly large. I mean, just to imagine how big these numbers are, if you have a book and you wrote 75 digits per line, 50 lines per page, and you wanted to express this number in base 10, it would take you 4,600 pages to write this down, okay? So sort of the monumentality of these things is really incredible. Now, this may be an exercise in vanity, but the prediction is that we will be able to find a 100 million digit prime by the year 2015 and a 1 billion digit prime by 2024. And there are cash prizes involved with it. That's what we're making your daughters do at Wellesley. Okay. So we haven't really talked about what these numbers have to do with anything, but we will in a couple slides. Let me remark about this thing called the Rsa Factoring Challenge, which was introduced by these 3 mathematicians in 1991. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to encourage computational number theory, and they wanted to see what the cutting edge research was in breaking down numbers, okay, how strong computers were. So what they did was they took 2 very, very, very large primes. They took very large primes, and they took a computer, they inputted these primes, and then they multiplied them together, okay? So that gave us a semi-prime, okay? So they did this 30 times, so they had 30 humongous semi-primes. Then they destroyed the computer, okay? So there would be no record of the original numbers that made up the semi-prime. They published the 30 semi-primes, and they dared anybody to break them, okay? And there were cash prizes involved in factoring these numbers, if that makes sense. So these were effectively like humongous puzzles that people had to solve. Well, the first number was this, okay? It's called RSA 100 because it has 100 digits. And it turned out that this number was not very strong in the sense that it was broken just in a few months by a very famous mathematician named Lenstra. He used a couple computers, and within a few days, he was able to bust this number. And he got $1,000 for it. Okay. So here's the number. Here are the 2 prime numbers that make up that number. Okay, I mean they're enormous. Okay, so the way that we call these numbers now is that the number itself, okay, with the 2 numbers that it comes from, is called a 100-bit key. Okay, it's called a key, and you might have heard things about encryption keys. This is the key. Okay, now for those of you who may not believe me, but the use of the word bit is usually done in binary, okay? So for those of you who might say, okay, a bit is really a binary object, it's actually a 300-bit key, because when you express this number in binary, it's actually about 300 digits long, okay? So this is an example of a 300-bit key. Here's an example of a 640-bit key, okay? And notice that the previous number was 100 digits long. It was broken in 1991. This number is 640 digits long, and it took 15 more years, okay? It was broken in 2005. It took 5 months of time, okay? And he got $20,000 for it. So it's not bad, Okay. So for example, this is called a 640-bit key. Okay. The numbers that the RSA published are in this grid. Okay. And the only numbers that mathematicians have been able to crack are these. Okay. So the technology is still not very advanced. It can't crack these numbers, even though you would think that a number with 490 digits is not that big, but it turns out to be just insuperably difficult. The cash prize part has ended in 2007, but people are still interested in factoring these numbers. Okay. Just to give you a sense of how difficult it is, when they cracked RSA 155 in 1999, it took 290 computers on the internet and a supercomputer 4 months, okay, to crack this thing. The computing power needed was an estimated 800 MIPS years. So a MIPS, okay, is a million processor instructions per second. Okay, so if you have a computer that's only operating at a million processor instructions per second, it would take you 8,000 years to crack this. Of course, nobody has a processor that slow, right? I mean, they did it in 5 months or 4 months. So the number of operators that they do per second is much more than a million. But I think that this gives us a sense of how, so for example, if I only had one very slow computer operating, trying to break this number, it would take 800 years. If using the same computer, I was interested in breaking a 1024-digit number, it would take me 800,000 MIPS centuries, okay? And for a number that's about 2,000 digits long, it would take 220, what is that number? Billion MIPS centuries, okay? Of course, again, we have computers now that can do about a quadrillion instructions per second. So these numbers don't mean much except relative to each other. All right. So let me explain to you how encryption works. Okay. In the world of encryption, the 2 people involved are always named Alice and Bob. Okay. They are. They like being. Right. So Alice wants to send a message to Bob. She wants it to be secure. Okay, but the mail is not secure. There are enemies, there are adversaries trying to break into it. Okay, what she does is that she calls up Bob. That's okay, right? She calls up Bob and she says, "I know that we're on an insecure line, okay, but I want you to send me a padlock." So, but what basically Bob does is that he sends an open padlock in the mail, and Alice receives it. Alice takes a box. She puts her message in the box and she locks it with Bob's padlock. Then she sends the entire thing back to Bob. And then Bob has the key, and he opens it and reads Alice's mail. Okay? At no point does Alice have Bob's key. Okay? At no point does anybody have Bob's key. Only Bob has his key. But the way that we see this in a diagram is that you have something called plain text, which is an email message. It's a credit card number. And what you want to do is you want to encrypt it. Okay? You encrypt it into this thing called ciphertext, which is usually, sometimes you see something on your screen like just garbage, right? That's an example of ciphertext. The ciphertext, so basically what happens is that Alice, okay, using Bob's padlock, sends a message which then is interpreted as ciphertext. Then she sends it, and then Bob, using his key, decrypts it, and then Bob gets back to the plain text, okay? Now, the problem with this diagram, which makes a lot of people confused, is that instead of a padlock, they call it a key, right? So there's a private key, which Bob holds onto, and there's a public key, which is the padlock. So I like to think of it as padlock plus key, rather than public key and private key, okay? But unfortunately, that's the terminology that we have. Now, this is what happens in daily practice, right? You want to buy something from Amazon, and you want to send your credit card. I hope this is not anybody's credit card. This is a credit card number. It is in plain text. So what Amazon does is it sends you this humongous semi-prime, which you never actually see, but it's happening in the background, okay? So what happens is that this semi-prime takes that number and it distorts it into something called cybertext, okay? Then this cybertext gets sent to Amazon, and then Amazon is the only one who knows how to break down this huge semi-prime. You see that? It has the key. Nobody else knows how this number breaks down. Okay? It uses this key to unlock this. Okay? So that's how secure so the security of your message depends on how difficult it is to break this. Right? Does that kind of make sense? So what does a hacker do? Okay? So a hacker can do one of two things. Okay? The hacker can So basically, the idea is you have a key. Okay, the key has a factorization, and nobody knows the factorization except for the vendor. Okay. Now, the problem with security is that the security is only secure when the two parties are honest. Okay. If the vendor is willing to sell your information to the NSA, or by law give it to the NSA, or to any third party, then it's no longer secure. Okay? So a hacker can try to obtain the information somehow by illegal means or by some covert means. Okay? So, for example, Skype was recently sold to eBay, but eBay for a very, very low price, right? But eBay found out that what it was getting did not involve what's called the source code. So it sold it back to Skype. Okay, it sold Skype back to Skype. Then Microsoft bought Skype with the source code. Okay, so basically what happens is that Skype may be compromised right now because Microsoft is maybe willing to allow third parties to look at it. So this is a problem for people in other countries who are journalists in a place where they may not have freedom of press, right? They are trying to communicate with each other using online means, but it's there's no guarantee anymore that these online means is secure. Okay. Now, the other way of hacking is to try to figure out, right, using a clever algorithm or a really strong computer, how to break the key, how to find the key. Okay. So the possibility of number 2 depends on the nature of the number and how strong your computer is. Okay, and it's fair to assume that the NSA is involved in both of these, right? Okay, so let me sort of explain to you where we are. Okay, so remember that a bit. So this refers to how long a number is. Okay, and the longer the number, the harder it is to factor. So at the moment, a 32-bit key or a 64-bit key is completely useless. Okay, like anybody can break them. Right? A 180-bit key, a 128-bit key can be broken if you have someone with sufficient amount of storage space in their computer. Okay, they can probably break it. A 512-bit key can be broken by an amateur who's very dedicated and who has a lot of time on his or her hands, right? And they have access to some very, very large PCs. Okay, they can be broken. So the standard like trying to use 512-bit encryption is useless these days when you want to send credit card information. This is where we are right now. Okay. So the standard these days is 1,024-bit keys. We do not believe that an amateur can break this right now. Okay. That the technology is still pretty secure for about 10 years. But there is increasing evidence, probably from the NSA, that these keys are deprecated in the sense that there are cases where these keys have been broken. Okay. So let me give you like a really cheeky video, not a video, but a cheeky website. There's this company called DigiCert, okay, which is a privacy company, and their standard is 2,048 bits at the moment. Okay. And they have this funny video. There's a video, but there's also this version right here, where they, how do I do this? I need this to be smaller. How do I get? Okay. So the idea here is that they are pitting your computer against the universe. Okay, so the idea is that you start cracking on your desktop, and the Big Bang has happened. Okay, at the same time, right? You see where this is going. So the Big Bang happens, stars form, the first galaxies form. You're still computing, right? You're still computing. The solar system forms. This is an actual website. I mean, our planet forms. Our sun grows to a red giant. It becomes a white dwarf. The universe explodes. There are no stars. And you are still 1/6 of the way there. Okay? And so they win, and the universe loses. Now the problem is, of course, that nobody is going to use their desktop to break this number, right? I mean, this thing doesn't quite make sense. Let me explain to you what the current status and predictions are. I mean, this is all very interesting stuff. I really like it. Okay, here's a good question. Why don't we just pick a key which is enormously large, like it has a million digits? Well, the problem is that decryption takes forever, right? So you need to choose a number which is big enough that you can't break, okay? But if you have the key, then you don't have to spend like days unlocking the key, okay? So the idea is that you have to find a number that's just right for the present day. Let's take a look at where we are. Let's look at the second column. All this other stuff, just take a look at this right here. The present day says that if you're interested in protecting something up to the year 2015, then we're really looking at about 1,000 digits. Okay? If you're interested in protecting something up to the year 2020, then we have to get a little bit bigger. Okay? And so this chart tells you that if we're interested in protecting data up to 2040, the standard at that time will be about 3,200 digits. Okay? And there's this thing called quantum computing, which evidently allows you to do anything you want. And if that is true, then the numbers have to be humongously large. So what used to be an incredibly difficult enterprise being done by hand is now an incredibly difficult process in enterprise done by computers. Okay? Now, I should say a little bit about Wellesley, and that is that in my abstract, I mentioned that most curricula start with calculus, right, in college. And it's become that way historically because calculus was necessary for engineering and physics and other science-related subjects. But mathematics in itself does not have to start with calculus. We are now spearheading a course called number theory at the first year level, by which students can learn things about decryption and sort of be introduced to mathematics from a different way. Of course, you still have to learn calculus, but there are many, many different avenues of studying mathematics that don't involve just calculus. So I hope that, my goal at Wellesley is try to rip the students away from the economics department and into the mathematics department. And so, I'm hoping that in some small way this lecture might have helped. So, my time is up. I bid you good day. And change your password. Yes?
Where do I get this from my stuff?
Where do I get what?
Encryption. If I went by my computer's on it.
Yeah, it's not really clear, I know it's a little bit like hazy about it. Everything happens behind the scenes. So yeah, I don't really, I don't have it. I'm assuming that the products that I use have their own security. So when I send a message, right, I'm basically relying on the fact, because I'm relying on the fact that the system itself has it built in, and that's just how things are. There's no way for me on Skype to send a message using my own security, right?
That's what I was doing, and then I recently found a file on my computer and all kinds of registry changes.
Yeah, this isn't, it's weird, yes? No, everything is basically done in when I say 124-bit, right, I really mean 124 binary numbers, but the processes are the same. When we see a base 10 number and its equivalent base 2 number, there's nothing mathematically different about them as far as algorithms go. They just look different because we write them differently. It's kind of like, words in foreign languages. They mean the same thing. Okay, yeah.
Are the keys specific to a transaction or to parties? Like a vendor, Amazon, chooses a semi-prime number and runs with it for 3 days, or is it for each transaction? And are there enough semi-primes?
I think that Amazon has in its repository countless of numbers of semi-primes. Okay, so for every transaction, it sends out a different one. Okay, and so what some people try to do is they try to break into Amazon's network and try to steal the semi-primes. And then you've all seen these hoaxes where they pretend to be Yahoo and they try to get you to put your password in, right? I mean, when they pretend to be the vendors, they're probably pretending to send you semi-primes. They're sending you semi-primes that they've stolen from somebody else, right? But I think that for every transaction, it's a different
And
semi-prime.
is it likely that large vendors have overlapping semi-primes, but it doesn't matter because you don't know what's being used?
Yes,
in a
yes,
particular
yeah,
transaction?
that's right. And I should say that not all primes are Mersenne primes, right? There are lots of primes that are not Mersenne. Yeah.
What about other numbers, like perfect numbers, oblong numbers?
You know, perfect,
Thing or-
I mean, you know, perfect numbers, the thing about perfect numbers is that they're always composite. Like, you know, the numbers 6, 28, 496, first of all, they're all even so far. We haven't found any odd perfect numbers. So there might be some other things that have to do with, I mean, if you can find a number and you have to do something with a number that takes a lot of time, right, then you can use it. But I'm not aware of things involving perfect numbers. Yeah.
So about the computation needed to break a semi-prime,
Yeah.
is that based on just the known algorithm so far? Is that proof that there's no way there's a more simpler way to break?
Oh, well, there are lots of different tools that you can do to try to break them. Okay. I don't know what all the tools are, but certain tools are better for breaking certain numbers than other tools. It just depends. Not every number is the same. Not every semi-prime takes the same amount of time to break. Some numbers are weaker than other numbers by some measure, right? So there are known tools, and certain tools work better for some numbers, but all of those tools take a long time. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was just wondering if there's another tool, maybe obviously nobody has discovered it, maybe one day,
Yes.
5 years from now.
Of course, yes, exactly.
So simple to break the prime.
Yes, in fact, this quantum computing, right, is in the effort of trying to break numbers, okay? But they've only been able to break the number 15 into 3 times 5. I'm serious, that's all they can do, right? The mechanism is so complicated that they can only break 15 at the moment, right? But who knows what will happen? They're developing tools all the time.
Speaking of passwords,
Yes.
so is it worth, changing our password if people can break into, if hackers can break in, and if not, how many digits do we need in our password, and do we need the different symbols in there?
Oh, right. So the issue about passwords is slightly different from this, okay? What happens is that there are different ways of hacking into things. And one of the things that hackers try to do to break into your own email is that they run dictionary searches, okay? And so if you have a word like Wellesley as your password, right, they can break it easily by trying to match it with dictionaries, okay? Or dictionaries plus some numbers, okay? So that's not really an issue at the moment with semi-primes, right? So what you want to do is you want to get a password which is unrecognizable enough to a dictionary. That's the point, right? That's why they keep wanting you to put those ampersands and commas and numbers in it, because there is no known dictionary that may actually have that. Okay, that's not quite the same as the semi-prime dictionary. Right? Yes.
You mentioned that certain numbers are weaker. Do we know what numbers are weaker?
I don't know what numbers are weaker, but there must be some way of telling. I mean, there's basically a battery of tests. Like, here's a test, here's another test, here's another test. And they must have these tests in some order so that if a number is broken by the first test, it's certainly weaker than all the other numbers that are not broken, right? So I just think that these numbers are too big. They can't really catalog which are the weak numbers. They can just guess. So as we speak, there are like millions of computers that are running right now trying to figure out how to break things. Yes?
So how do one deal with the problem that some people are hacking at the moment prior to the encryption? And
Yeah.
after it's been encrypted?
I don't know. That's really difficult. I mean, in a sense, that kind of depends on the nature of the relationship between companies, right, that are managing your data, like Google and Microsoft, and their relationships with large government agencies like the NSA. There's not much that we can do except not use their products. We don't know what happened. We don't know, NSA keeps showing up in the news. It showed up yesterday because evidently it was infiltrating the love correspondences between NSA employees or something like that. It's not really clear what they have access to and what they don't. I mean, these things are just unknowable. So you're asking a question for which there is no real answer. Difficult.
about using open source?
Oh, yeah, I don't know much about, yeah, I guess, I don't know. I'm a topologist, you know. I'm not a number theorist. All right, so maybe we should.
Thanks, that was great.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.